Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time Sherman just graduated from West Point. Now we move with him through his time in the Army before hostilities between the United States and Mexico broke out. Fresh out of West Point, Sherman was given a furlough until his official duty took place. He visited the Ewings in Ohio, where he got to meet presidential hopeful William Henry Harrison. Ellen Ewing, his foster sister, invited him to a fancy dress party where Sherman wore his uniform. During the party, a bat flew into the room, startling the guests. Sherman took the initiative and with his hat began to flail at the creature as it flew around the room. He was finally able to chase it out an open door, but made the guests say that Sherman had won his first battle as a soldier. Sherman would be a part of the 3rd U.S. Artillery, and his assignment would be in Florida. At the end of the summer, he departed New York, where he would get on a ship destined for the swampy state. Before he left, he visited West Point to meet with some of the underclassmen. It was against the rules to visit cadets during study hours, but Sherman believed his lieutenancy gave him special privileges. It didn't. The superintendent cited him for unofficer-like conduct and confined him to the hotel grounds. After Sherman wrote the superintendent an apology, he was released from the hotel. He then traveled back to New York City, where with a black pointer dog as a companion, he set off for Florida. He arrived at Fort Pierce amid a war between the United States and the Seminole Indian tribe. The Second Seminole War was in its 4th year in the fall of 1840, and Sherman would get his first taste of military duty in the regular army in the swamps of Florida. Fort Pierce was unimpressive, and he believed a concerted effort would lead to the capture of the fort, but like most military men, he believed the Native Americans were too cowardly to attack a fort. Since the Army didn't campaign in the hot, humid months, troops performed recreational activities around the fort. One of Sherman's hobbies was fishing. While there, he was taught how to spear a shark and catch redfish, sheepshead, and mullet. He also helped build nets to capture green turtles, which were kept in cages and fattened and eaten later. He gathered a variety of livestock, including chickens, a cow, and a fawn. The strictness of West Point was nowhere to be found in Florida, and Sherman relished this time, but the soldiers who had been stationed there for months and years warned him of the extreme heat and humidity of the Florida summers. His friend Stuart Van Vliet was there too, and the two grew closer in their friendship as they shared the hardships and lifestyle of a soldier. Despite there being no Native American attacks, Sherman still encountered death firsthand. A soldier shot one of the sergeants over an altercation involving the soldier's wife. Members of a whaleboat crew connected to the fort drowned and their bodies mutilated by sharks. Sherman also had a hand in death at the fort. When the post doctor requested leave to go courting a lady, Sherman agreed to take his place. The next day, Sherman suspected a sick soldier of faking his ailment and ordered a sergeant to run the man around the fort. The run killed the man. One of Sherman's interactions with Native Americans came when Coacoochee, a chief in his late 20s, approached Army leaders in March 1841, agreeing to move he and his people out of Florida if supplies were provided. An Indian party approached Fort Pierce, and a black man speaking for Coacoochee produced his safe conduct pass to Major Childs, commander of the fort. Childs agreed to honor the pass and told Sherman to take 10 men to escort the chief to the fort. Sherman traveled with the party for 6 miles, then came to Coacoochee's camp. The chief introduced himself to Sherman, bathed in a nearby pool, and put on a series of vests, one of them with a blood-stained bullet hole. When Coacoochee arrived at the fort, he told Major Childs that he would lead his people out of Florida by the end of the month if the Army would supply him and his people with rations. Childs agreed, and the rest of the evening, Coacoochee and his party got drunk on commissary whiskey. By the end of the month, only Coacoochee and 20 people appeared. A frustrated Childs arrested the chief and the 20 men, and sent Sherman and some others on a 50-mile search for the rest, but they were never found. Coacoochee was sent to New Orleans, but was brought back to round up others for their forced migration west of the Mississippi River. By the summer of 1841, Sherman was depressed. After only a month into his term as president, Whig politician William Henry Harrison had died. Sherman had faith that a soldier like Harrison would launch a war of extermination against the Seminoles, but his hopes got dashed and he was to remain in Florida, fighting a guerrilla war and enduring the dangers of the Florida heat. By November, he was promoted to first lieutenant and transferred to St. Augustine. There, he guarded a road to St. Augustine with a 20-man detachment located about 18 miles away from the city. He enjoyed the solitude of the post as well as its closeness to St. Augustine with its 3,000 inhabitants. While there, he described the young Spanish women there as ignorant but very pretty with beautiful hair and eyes. Many of the ladies got married to army officers, but Sherman didn't intend to be betrothed to them. The only woman he kept up a constant correspondence with was his foster sister Ellen. He wouldn't remain there long. By March 1842, the Seminole War ended, with the entire war being a huge drain on resources, manpower, and money. Sherman and his unit would then travel to Fort Morgan in Alabama to man the fortress. Not only was he the first lieutenant, he was also the unit's quartermaster, which meant that he had to make regular trips to Mobile to get supplies. Sherman liked the city, but found it very expensive. Nonetheless, he enjoyed its theatrical plays, parties, and he even took a hot air balloon ride. The Ewing family continuously tried to get him to resign his commission, but he refused. Ellen Ewing was also concerned about his lack of religion. Sherman confessed that he hadn't practiced any religion since leaving for West Point 6 years before. By June, the unit was transferred again, this time to Charleston, South Carolina at Fort Moultrie. There, he would get to see and spend time with his two fellow West Pointers, George H. Thomas and Braxton Bragg. Charleston amazed Sherman. Its 3,000 inhabitants and busy market and wharves made it a fascinating place to be. He had a lot of free time on his hands. All of his military duties ended after 9 a.m., and he had the whole day until 7 a.m. the next morning to do as he wished. In Charleston, parties happened almost nightly, and the officers regularly attended, but Sherman and the others soon characterized them as a chore because of the monotony of doing the same dances and having the same conversation every party. To break the monotony, he fished and explored the countryside, rounded up deserters, and sat on a few courts-martial boards. His placement as first in his drawing class identified his ability as an artist. While at Moultrie, he found it hard to put down the brush, completing both portraits and landscapes. Sherman also got to indulge his love of politics while at Moultrie. Since he was a soldier, he didn't participate in politics, but that didn't stop him from reading and writing about politics. In Charleston, the hotbed of states' rights ideals and nullification, egged on by men like John C. Calhoun, surrounded Sherman. He detested the ideas of nullification, which he believed isolated South Carolina from the rest of the country because it went against the national union. When discussions arose about a possible war with Britain over Oregon or with Mexico over Texas, Sherman believed the wars were needed to preserve the country's respect around the world. Slavery constantly surrounded him while in Charleston. Everywhere one looked, one could see slave labor as it powered the city. One of Sherman's biographers wrote, "Sherman had adopted the Southern attitude towards slavery. It was a part of the natural order. He had a slave in both Mobile and Charleston, and he strongly defended the institution in letters home, on one occasion using Fort Moultrie's sorrow over the death of Braxton Bragg's retainer to demonstrate the strong attachment between master and slave. He insisted he was no advocate of slavery, but then said it was a delirium to believe that oppression and tyranny were its necessary accompaniment. He had never seen the least sign of disaffection on the part of slaves anywhere in South Carolina, he argued, and he had seen them in the cotton fields and rice ditches, met them hunting at all hours of the day and on the road at night, without saying but a welcome greeting and them asking for tobacco. Sherman spoke out against the abolitionists of the North and accused them of fomenting dissent and irritation in the South. He felt that Southerners should deal with the slavery question by themselves without Northern interference. Sherman also complained about government cutbacks for the Army. With the Seminole War ended, Congress decided to reduce the size of the Army and to cut the salaries of officers. Sherman himself would lose $40 a year with the cutbacks, a large amount to a first lieutenant. He didn't want the reduction in the Army size, but continually wrote about how few duties he had to accomplish. In the summer of 1843, he took a 5-month furlough to Ohio and returned to Charleston by way of the Mississippi River. In his diary, he was absolutely fascinated with the cities along the Great River, especially St. Louis, Vicksburg, and others. Judging from his diary, his return trip was one of the most enjoyable parts of his furlough. In February 1844, Sherman was assigned to the Army's Inspector General to help investigate a claim of lost equipment and horse in the Seminole War. He reported to Colonel Sylvester Churchill at Marietta, Georgia, and interrogated the claimant. While in Georgia, he explored Kennesaw Mountain and took topographical notes about the terrain. He also spent time at the Federal Arsenal in Augusta, Georgia. He returned to Charleston in the summer of 1844. During his furlough the previous summer, he decided to marry his foster sister Ellen. One of Sherman's biographers wrote, "He regularly used the mail as a way to formulate his thoughts, vent his frustrations, and work out his options, but he said nothing about his marriage decision. Neither Sherman nor Ellen ever discussed the reasons for their decision. Sherman wrote Thomas Ewing asking for Ellen's hand, and despite some momentary hesitation at the thought of his daughter and his foster son marrying, Ewing consented. No one else ever commented on the unusual nature of the proposed union. The engagement was hectic. Helen wanted Sherman to dedicate himself to Catholicism, resign his commission, and move to Ohio and become a lawyer. Sherman didn't want to do any of that. He had found security in the Army, and he didn't want to return to Ohio and work because he would feel as though he was still in the shadow of Thomas Ewing. Over the course of the next couple of years, they discussed the situation in depth, her not wanting to move around with the Army and he not wanting to leave the Army. At one point, they thought they would compromise and she would be willing to move to East Tennessee if he resigned his commission, but Sherman had his heart set on moving further south. He had spent many years there and enjoyed it. Finally, Ellen agreed that Sherman could stay in the Army until they married.